The film was mostly shot in Mexico City. Locations were found there that resembled as closely as possible Tegucigalpa and the train station at Chapachula. Parts were also shot in Torreon, Coahuila, Mexico. Several of the extras used in the film were actual migrants. The film director, Cary Fukunaga, spent 2 years researching the film, spending time with people on the trains and with gangsters in Central America. He used 2 gang members to help make the slang and language as realistic as possible. The film has received many awards, including the Austin Film Critics Association Best Foreign Language Film and the Dallas-Fort Worth Film Critics Association Best Foreign Language Film. Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's expert discussant, Nicole Ramos. Nicole is the director of Al Otro Lado's Border Rights Project, which provides legal orientation and know your rights training to migrants in Tijuana, Mexico, people who wish to present themselves to U.S. authorities in order to seek asylum. The project also conducts daily human rights monitoring at the U.S. port of entry and engages in impact litigation in the U.S. and broader advocacy campaigns before regional and international human rights monitoring bodies in order to challenge systematic human rights violations committed by state actors. Nicole frequently serves as a guest lecturer at law schools and universities across the country. Prior to joining Al Otro Lado, Nicole spent 6 years working as an assistant federal defender with the Federal Defender Program in Montgomery, Alabama, where she represented individuals charged with federal felony offenses and individuals on Alabama's death row, challenging the constitutionality of their death sentence in federal district court. Al Otro Lado, with Nicole's office in Tijuana, Baja California, assists refugees before they engage with American officials. The Migrant Center for Human Rights assists them in legal matters after they have arrived in the United States. So the 2 organizations are complementary. Now I want to turn it over to Nicole for some general comments before asking her some questions. Throughout our conversation, if you have any questions, please be sure to put them into the chat box, and I'll do what I can to keep up with them. Nicole, can you begin by explaining what the current U.S. policies are, such things as metering, third country removal, MPP, Operation Capio, etc.? Nicole? You'll have to unmute. There you go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me this evening. So there's several current policies that are bearing down on the lives of migrants at the U.S. and Mexico border at this time. The first of these policies to roll out was called metering. And metering is just a fancy word for a wait list. And what that means is that asylum seekers who normally under previous years would have been able to walk up to the port of entry, tell a immigration officer that they feared for their life, that they wanted to seek asylum, and the law requires them to be taken in for processing, be given an interview, potentially considered for a release, and then they would go on to their court case from inside the United States. What the metering policy does is it forces those asylum seekers to stop and to put their name on a wait list that is frequently operated by officers in Mexican immigration or other agents of the Mexican government. And the wait list, there's no way around it. If you have an urgent medical need, if you have, if you're an immediate risk and the person that you're fleeing or persons that you're fleeing are persecuting you and following you through Mexico, there's just no exceptions. And sometimes that wait list can last for anywhere up to 9 months. So you have essentially vulnerable people, vulnerable for many different reasons, who are stuck at the border for anywhere from 6 to 9 months. Then once those folks get into the United States, they've been given their opportunity to present themselves to a US border official. They've said that they fear a return to their home country. It's quite possible for many of them, at least if they are from a country in Latin America, that they will be sent back to Mexico to continue on with their proceedings while waiting in Mexico. That is called the Remain in Mexico policy. It's also known as the Migrant Protection Protocols. We refer to it on the ground as the Migrant Persecution Protocols because that feels more accurate as to what is going on here. And the Trump administration came up with this very insane logic that they were instituting MPP so that migrants went to court, because apparently no one was showing up for court. So this would ensure that they went to court, and it would also cut down on human trafficking and human smuggling. It has had the exact opposite effect of what we've seen on the ground by forcing people to live in shelters and other types of really substandard, squalid living conditions, including tent cities and sleeping on the street. You're virtually ensuring that people don't have the resources to show up to court, or that they're disappeared or some other kind of harm befalls them and they never make it to court. And it also has had the consequence of increasing human trafficking, because organized crime understands that the US border policies keep people trapped here. That's common knowledge along the border. And so border cities are normally hubs for things like sex trafficking, drug trafficking, arms trafficking. Now that has increased exponentially because organized crime understands that there is this group, this population that is essentially being held hostage, and they are outside of their home communities. Many of them are not traveling with loved ones, or they're traveling with just a few loved ones. So there's not going to be a lot of people looking for them if they are disappeared or forced into some kind of trafficking situation. And even if people do know that they were disappeared and they are traveling with family members, they have such little political capital in Mexican society, being migrants, that nothing is likely going to be done if something were to happen to them. So added onto that policy, the Trump administration came out last year with something called the transit rule. And the transit rule means that if a person transited through another country, third country that is not the United States and is not their home country, on their way to get to the United States border to seek asylum, that they are no longer eligible to seek asylum, that they would have had to have applied for asylum in one of the countries that they transited through and got rejected. And then they might be eligible for asylum. So you have people who are operating without a lot of information. They understand asylum is international law, that US law has asylum, and they are going to a place where they feel like they're going to get protection. They're not expecting all of these barriers to be put in their way, such as a wait list, such as being sent back to Mexico, and then such as being told that you're not even eligible to apply for asylum in the first place. You're only eligible to apply for much harder forms of humanitarian relief that you're probably not going to get if you are representing yourself. What we have also as an issue with MPP, and just across the board generally with asylum seekers, is that there's a lack of access to counsel. There's very low rates of representation among asylum seekers generally. Those low rates increase exponentially if you factor in whether a person is detained in an immigration detention facility. And then the representation rate is less than 1% for people who are returned to Mexico in the MPP program. You know, and some people may say, well, it doesn't impact that many people. You know, we need this program for whatever reason you want to justify it, but it really does impact tens and thousands of people. Right now, there's approximately 60,000 people that are waiting in Mexico on their proceedings in US asylum courts. It is really a policy that is going to impact families and communities for generations to come. Now, what we've seen in the light of COVID-19 is a complete closure of the border to asylum seekers under the guise of a very little used law that allows for the government to deny entry to immigrants that they believe may be carrying infectious diseases. And so that's where the Capio memos come in, and basically Border Patrol and CBP have been instructed to turn away refugees regardless of claims that they make of fear for their home country or their fear of being returned to Mexico. They're just supposed to be sent right back to Mexico. No paperwork, no processing, just turn them around.
So the in the movie, the young lady, Syria, as soon as she crosses the river, her immediate problems are basically over. And that's no longer the case, is it?
No, and that's something that when I was thinking about the comments in the movie for today is that would no longer be possible. So maybe she gets across, but Border Patrol would just take her to, they wouldn't send her back across the river. Like they would take her to a border point and send her right back out through the port of entry. And because organized crime, they have operatives that collaborate with the Mexican government. They have operatives that collaborate with Border Patrol and CBP. They know this information. They understand how policy impacts people along the border. And so they would just wait near the border point where she would likely to be returned.
Okay. I'm just reminded of an old classmate of mine from Mexico, Jorge Bustamante, who went from the U.S. back into Mexico and then came in illegally and wrote up his experiences in about 30 years ago, a famous book, A Story of the Wetback. And his problem before he was caught by the immigration officers was snakes. There was a lot of danger in just being in that river area, walking out in the wilderness. So now we have more than snakes. What constraints, what problems lead? If somebody has dogs, if you can make sure you mute. Thank you. What problems lead youths into the Honduran and other Central American gangs? Because there's that side of it that looks like it's a push factor into creating refugees.
Sorry, those dogs are mine. They're actually in another room, but they're
Okay.
relentless. So there's a lot of factors at play that lead to just these wide swaths of youth being forced in, recruited, or voluntarily joining gangs. In the late 1990s, we began deporting members of MS-13 and 18th Street from the United States. Those were gangs that were actually started by Salvadoran immigrants in the 80s, early 90s in Los Angeles. And we just got sick of the gang problem, not just with them, but with gangs across the board. So we figured, okay, well, we have the ability to deport these non-citizen gang members and send them back to their countries of origin. So we started sending people back to countries that we had essentially destabilized through foreign intervention, whether that was through trade deals or installing or training people at the School of the Americas and other similar programs that would go on to commit human rights abuses in Central America. And so we sent back these folks that were incredibly damaged from their years of gang life, of prison life, into countries that were very ill-equipped to reintegrate them. And so they continued because being in a gang is not just being in a gang for your own financial interests, it's also being part of something, being part of a family that maybe you didn't have at home or a community that you didn't have. And so those communities or those families were replicated in places that were just not equipped to provide training or reintegration or other kinds of supportive services that someone who survived violent trauma would require in order to become a productive member of society. And so you layer that on there, and with the lack of economic opportunity created by U.S. foreign intervention and transnational corporations, there's really not a lot of places for people to go. And with that, gangs have, they have incredible, at this point, political power. They operate essentially as shadow governments, as do cartels in Mexico, where they are occupying functions that one would normally associate to the state if the state was under martial law. So checkpoints of going in and out of neighborhoods, people monitoring who goes in and out of police stations and what those complaints are about, buying military grade weapons from the military, donating funds to political candidates, and being able to sway elections, or whether that be for a district attorney or a judge or an actual elected government official. So there really is not a lot of options, because the gangs are not only, they're a family, they are a criminal organization, obviously, but they also occupy the place of the state. And so you're asking young children to really resist a lot. And gangs play upon this concept, this family value of, you have a really united family, you do everything to keep your family safe. And they say, well, if you don't join the gang, I'm going to rape your sister, or I'm going to kill your grandma. And so kids feel this incredible pressure to join in order to also keep not only themselves safe, but their family members safe.
Okay, we have a question from a listener. You were saying that the gangs are a government of sorts. Are there any effort to negotiate with the gangs?
There have been efforts to negotiate gang truce between warring gangs like 18th Street and MS 13th Street. And MS 13. But I'm not aware of direct efforts to organize as if they are a political party that are out in the open. There are certainly videos that have come out where you see politicians negotiating with gang members. You see police officers negotiating with gang members, but that's not something that they're necessarily putting out for the public consumption.
Okay. One thing that struck me watching the film, and I knew this intellectually, but it's always more powerful when it's portrayed, was the macho culture of the gangs and of the wider society for that matter, and the sexism involved in that. Is that one of the push factors that brings young ladies in particular to flee their situation in Central America?
Gender norms are or gender roles are very, very pronounced, I would say, throughout a lot of Latin America. I personally live in Mexico, and I would feel that we have the same sort of really pronounced gender norms here in Mexico. So it's not only just impacting women asylum seekers, but it's also impacting asylum seekers that identify as LGBTQ and are maybe not presenting themselves or living their life in conformance with what the society believes is normal for their biological sex. And so it's a huge push factor. We have many cases that we see in our clinic of women and girls that are in forced girlfriend, forced wife situations with gang members. So they essentially never wanted to be a partner with this person. And it was as if they were chattel. They said, I'm going to take you and you're going to come with me. And if you don't, here are the consequences that can happen to you or your family. In other instances, we have women who voluntarily entered a relationship with someone who's in a gang, or maybe someone who joined the gang after the relationship started. And they wanted to leave, for whatever reason, that was not a relationship that they wanted to be in anymore, whether it was because it was violent or because there were other factors that they just didn't want to be around. You see them unable to leave, unable to express their own independent decision as to who they want to maintain their time with because of this role. Like, I am the macho man, you are my property, you are mine, and you don't get to leave unless I say you get to leave. And unfortunately, law enforcement is really ineffectual in a lot of the countries in Central America, and certainly in Mexico. We have numerous clients that make multiple reports, and there's nothing that is ever really done to the abuser. They might have to pay a fine, they might have to pay a short period of time in jail, but a woman really needs to present with life-threatening injuries in order for anything to happen. And even in that case, we've had many cases where we've had women that were forced to live the rest of their lives in a wheelchair with other kinds of support, like not just a regular wheelchair, but a supported wheelchair, because they couldn't do a lot of things on their own. And their abusers are still out walking free.
Did you find the film realistic in terms of the situations that people face?
Unfortunately, yes, I did find it really realistic, and that's always triggering because it very much mirrors a lot of the stories that we hear from folks that have traveled on the train or have migrated while they're actively being pursued by gang members in Central America. And so that sort of harrowing, just missing death by moments is something that happens to our clients a lot. Along their journey, especially if they're taking La Bestia, the freight train, throughout Mexico.
Right. I think there's been a regime change in Mexico since the film was made in 2009. Does the present Mexican government provide any real protection for these people on the train and the refugees who arrive at the northern border?
Well, the Mexican people were really excited about AMLO coming into power. He was known as an intellectual, an academic, someone who respected human rights. However, people are exceptionally disappointed. He's actually enacted more policies and engaged in brutal treatment that rivals the prior president. They said that they were going to provide a lot of humanitarian protections, such as humanitarian visas that could be extended and converted into residence at some point, that they were going to, for all the asylum seekers that were sent back to Mexico under MPP, they were going to provide healthcare and work permits and integration, helping integrating kids into school. None of that has materialized. People may get a humanitarian visa that will last them a year, but it's really challenging to get it renewed if you don't have an advocate that's fighting for you before Mexican immigration. Kids, for the most part, are not in school, so you have children that are experiencing huge interruptions to their education, complete absence of medical care. The only medical care that a lot of migrants are getting is being provided by nonprofits such as myself that are volunteer driven, except in the medical field. And so you have even just extreme circumstances of, one couple we were working with, this migrant couple, the husband literally got arrested at the hospital trying to force them to attend to his wife because she was about to have a baby. And that's just the extent of the medical care there. And the Mexican government has done very, very little to provide for people, including providing basic police protections. It's really not uncommon for migrants to attempt to report crimes against them and for those to go uninvestigated because their lives are not deemed worthy enough of protection the way someone they would consider an affluent Mexican citizen worthy of protection. A really stark example of this would be we saw an increase in kidnappings of families with young children and young women themselves once MPP became really in full force and they were sending lots of people back per day. And Mexico in general is a hub for sex trafficking. Border cities in particularly, Tijuana is known as a hub for the production of child pornography. So it's really not coincidental that around the time that lots of children started getting trapped here, we started seeing more attacks to kidnap children from their parents or to kidnap and disappear entire families. And some of our other community partners organizations have tried to lobby the police about this issue, and they're completely aware of it. We're aware of it, but there's nothing that we can do.
Yeah. One of the main protagonists in the movie, the three main ones, one of them was Smiley, the little boy who learns the ropes and follows orders even to kill. And it strikes me as kind of ironic. The American officials seem to have a very similar ethos. It may not be directly killing people, but they're following orders, no matter what the consequences are. And did that strike you as kind of a moral dilemma, not just in the people depicted, but for our society?
I definitely view it as a moral dilemma for our society. We don't have to look that far back in our history to remember how we turned away a boatload of Jewish children during the Holocaust, and a lot of those people ultimately died in the concentration camps. So we have a lot of examples in our society of where we turn our back on people and then ultimately they're murdered. I think I have a hard time making the comparison between Smiley and officers that would say, "Well, I'm just following orders" as a justification for their actions. It's because he's a child, and he has been indoctrinated since birth with this is what you're supposed to do, this is what you're supposed to do, and he really doesn't have a lot of free choice. And for the same reason why we don't think children can enter into contracts or marriage or make decisions about serving in the military, it's because their brains are not really fully developed. So I find his actions obviously reprehensible and really tragic, but looking at him as a child growing in that circumstances, I can't really compare them to a border patrol officer that has an education or just a baseline education, as their excuse, well, I'm just doing this following orders as somehow equivalent. Because also Smiley is, if we're gonna split hairs about it, he's killed one person, right? That's in itself objectively horrible. But we have Border Patrol officers that are part of this system, this machine that is designed to literally torture immigrants that are coming. Many of them are fleeing torture or some kinds of other kinds of really severe harm, including really severe violence. And we are enacting state-sponsored violence through how we process them, how we treat them, in order to give them the protection that they so desperately seek. And to me, that really is a sadism that there's just no equivalent for.
Okay. Before we go to further questions, there's a note from Sarah Ramey, who's the executive director of the Migrant Center for Human Rights. She says, on June 15th, the administration published a proposed rule that would reinterpret asylum law in many aspects, including political opinion, particular social group, gangs and gender, and persecution. Stay tuned for a Migrant Center legal analysis of this rule and how you can submit a public comment on whether this rule should become law. So maybe we can get more about that in the chat. I've been forewarned that our present Zoom session will be cut off at 40 minutes, whether we're done or not. So the meeting has been upgraded by the host and now includes unlimited minutes. Okay, we could speak at length. So there will be a legal analysis from a practicing immigration attorney after we are done with the questions. I've wondered, what if we had a different legal framework that made the border between Mexico and the United States more or less open, that anybody without, a serious criminal record could cross, get employment, after 5 years apply for citizenship, and that would work in either direction. Is that at all feasible, or is it just a pipe dream that I have?
I don't think it's a pipe dream. I do think it's feasible. What's really interesting about the border is it kind of works that way in the reverse for US citizens that want to live in Mexico. There are, I would say, dozens or maybe even 100,000 US citizens that live in Mexico right now. And a lot of them do not have any immigration status. They are either here on a visitor visa that they renew repeatedly and just pretend like they're visiting, or they don't have any status and they buy homes and they work. A lot of them work online, or maybe they cross the border to work. And that nobody really bats an eye about it. It's the issue is when people are coming into the US to work, to settle, to send money back home, that it really becomes problematic. And so I think if it can work in the other direction, we can certainly make it work for us. The US government has amazing information sharing agreements with the Mexican government, with Central America, such that information about criminal convictions is very, very easily shared with the touch of a button, as well as not just criminal convictions, but encounters with law enforcement. And the reason why we know this is when we saw the crisis of family separation rear its ugly head in 2018, a lot of the families that we were working with, we would look at the records as the justifications as to why somebody was separated. And some people were separated from their child because they had a charge for driving under the influence 5 years ago. We know one father that we worked with, he was playing soccer. He was in a community soccer league, and the police did a raid or a sweep of the soccer field trying to find gang members, because also sometimes the gang would frequent the soccer field. He himself was not a gang member. Everyone was sort of taken up in this sweep. Their names were taken, and ultimately he was, released. There was no charges. He was never detained for a really long time. Just that really brief encounter with law enforcement went on his record, and that was shared with U.S. border officials, and it was used as a justification as to why he should be separated from his child and put in detention, and his child sent to a children's shelter. So I know that we have the ability to receive information about who is coming to our border and to keep out people that we would identify as criminal convictions too serious that we really want to have them enter. The other issue is that we have these huge pockets in the United States, in cities, or not cities, in rural areas that are either have never really been populated, or they're losing their populations because people are moving, their young people are moving to cities and they're just going to other states. But so you have these ghost towns, and at least where I was in Alabama previously, we saw amazing contributions by immigrants where they would revive these towns that were just on their last leg, and there would be schools, there would be dances, there would be bakeries, there would be tamales, and they had so much to contribute, and they were just so happy to have a place that felt safe and affordable. There's a really great poem by this British Somali poet, Warsan Shire, called Home. And I really encourage you all to at least read it or watch it on YouTube. And the premise of that is, no one wants to leave home. You only leave home when home tells you have to leave, that it's no longer a safe place for you to stay. And you don't go put your kids in a boat if the land itself feels more dangerous. And everyone, we all have the right to bodily autonomy, to live free, to live safe, to have a place where we can be with our families, and not be subject to these epic levels of violence. And that's all folks really want. And people have been migrating for as long as we have been a species. And it's this natural instinct. You want to migrate to a place where you feel safe and where you can flourish with your family. And so what we're denying is that basic right.
I'm still kind of in the picture, and she's talking.
I hear Maria Tobin. Okay, she's muted herself, I guess. I can recognize that Irish accent any place. I myself lived in Canada for 5 years, and I was actually entitled to vote. Their legal framework, of course, is different from ours, but that was one thing that absolutely floored me, that where this was before NAFTA, and whereas I had to have some reason to be in the country, I couldn't just migrate there on a whim, but they would allow me to vote as a landed immigrant, as they would call it. I was thinking about this problem of the gangs. Early in the last century, the kind of the progressive movement, setting up settlement houses and the like, created parks. In Chicago, they had gang liaisons, as it were, officials who would kind of keep after the gangs and try to keep them out of trouble. They had athletic leagues. They had craft shops. They had any number of ways, to keep the little hands busy. And I'm just wondering, what comparable program could there be at the present time to do something about the urban gang problem, or more specifically in the literature, they call it the boy gang problem. Do you have any ideas? Or you're an attorney, not a social worker. You're muted.
Actually, I used to be a social worker before I was an attorney, and I come from a family of teachers, so I have some opinions about this. We don't invest globally, both in the U.S. and in Central America, these sending countries. We don't invest in child education. We don't invest in women in terms of their integration into the workforce. So the choice is not leave my child with a stranger versus go to work. We don't invest in early childhood education, where kids went for these sponges and they have the ability to assimilate all this information much more quickly than they would as they progress to getting older. We don't invest in the kinds of subsidies that are needed to support rural farming communities that have been impacted by global, transnational companies that have dispossessed them of their lands, and then civil war, particularly in Guatemala, which was started by the CIA and lasted for 36 years. So we don't have any of those really foundational investments in people to get them to possibly avoid a gang lifestyle, because people join a gang when they don't have other options. Not everyone in El Salvador, not all youth in El Salvador are in a gang or are forced to be in a gang. It's about where you live and what your options are, and your ability to not only just move physically in the space, but to move throughout society.
Okay, we have a final question from another social worker. Okay. Is there any hope of a breakthrough with gangs? Any churches tackling this problem with gangs? I contribute to Oxfam, and Any hope there?
Well, I am a person that I always believe that there is hope. So my answer is yes. I think the gang issue is really complex and it's really dangerous for people to take on. There are a lot of churches that do anti-gang intervention work. The issue with that, however, becomes that gangs turn on those congregations or those networks because they serve as a competing recruiting force. So we have a fair amount of claims of people who are were very involved in their church communities and were involved in gang intervention work through their church communities and were persecuted by gangs for their work, and then they were ultimately forced to flee. I think it's really hard for once a child in Central America joins a gang for them to get out of the gang. So I think not only do we have to focus on programming to prevent people from entering gangs, but to focus on rehabilitation programs so that I could leave a gang at age 10, I could leave at 20, I could leave at 30, that there's a way out for me that feels safe and that feels possible.
Okay. Well, finally, I understand that you have some volunteering opportunities at El Otro Lado, and we will be putting information about these, I think, on the chat box or something in a few minutes, and also some for the Migrant Center for Human Rights. Could you tell us a little bit about those at El Otro Lado?
Well, there's a little bit of everything to be done. We run our office. We have a pretty skeletal staff. We have 3 offices in 3 cities, but we only have 30 staff. Yeah, we served last year in just one of our programs over 6,000 people, and that's largely through volunteers. And even in light of COVID and that we're not physically in our office and everything is being done remotely, it's all being done with our small staff, but through the support of lots of volunteers. So we have volunteers that help us with administrative tasks, such as data entry. We have volunteers that help us by looking up resources in different communities where we know clients are going to wind up, and we want to make sure that they have a good lead on what the resources are. We have client-specific, interviews, helping to put together declarations or evidence packets. And you don't necessarily have to be an attorney because we operate from a strength-based model. We believe in crowdsourcing lots of different people with lots of different backgrounds working on a very impossible problem together. And we're able to achieve a lot more results that way by instead of just saying, okay, well, we can only take these kinds of people because it takes all kinds of people to care about this issue and to attack it. So I would just encourage folks who are interested in doing some remote work for people that are on the Mexico side of the border wanting to come this way and seek asylum to just send us a message at the application link, and then we can begin talking about what some of the opportunities look like, because they're also changing and rotating depending on what we need that particular month.
Well, we'll say to the audience now, thank you very much for joining us. You're free to stay on, I think, for the legal analysis that we mentioned before. Next week, there will be another film. An email message will go out identifying what film it is, so it's kind of same time, same station. For more information about our organization, please visit migrantcenter.org or follow us on Facebook. You can also email us at admin@migrantcenter.org to subscribe to our listserv for updates. Please consider donating to the Migrant Center for Human Rights to help us continue providing free and low-cost legal services to detained asylum seekers. And if you can volunteer for El Otro Lado or for the Migrant Center for Human Rights, the volunteer information for the Migrant Center is actually in the chat box right now. Please check there at the chat box. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.